The aluminum cart's wheel caught on uneven commissary tiles as Ezra Whitmore navigated Norfolk Naval Base's crowded aisles. His weathered hands gripped the handle with careful precision. The cane hooked over his left arm, swaying with each measured step. At 84, every movement was calculated against the possibility of falling. "Grandpa, want me to push that?" Tommy asked, his 12-year-old frame dwarfed by towering shelves of military goods. "I've got it, son. Exercise keeps these old bones moving." Saturday afternoon crowds pressed around them, young sailors with families, career officers checking precisely written lists. Ezra timed their trips for busy hours, finding anonymity where his slow pace drew fewer stares. Reaching for soup, his movements deliberate and measured. The cart's front wheel caught an obstacle. The sudden stop lurched his body forward, sending the cart sideways into another shopper's path. The collision was gentle, barely a tap, but created immediate disruption in the crowded aisle. "Watch where you're going." Commander Derek Lawson's voice cut through ambient noise like a blade. He stood beside his overturned cart, face flushed with disproportionate anger. His uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp, every insignia positioned with mathematical precision. At 38, he carried aggressive confidence that demanded immediate attention and absolute deference. "I'm sorry," Ezra said quietly, hands already moving to collect scattered items. "I didn't see. Are you blind and stupid, old man?" The commissary held its breath. Conversations died as heads turned toward the confrontation. Tommy stepped closer, his young face burning with embarrassment and confusion. "Sir, I apologize," Ezra repeated, maintaining steady calm despite verbal assault. "Let me help." "Don't touch my things." Lawson stepped forward, chest puffed with authority. "You civilians need to learn to stay out of the way. This is a military installation, not some retirement home." Ezra straightened slowly. For just a moment, something flickered in his posture, a phantom echo of parade ground bearing that disappeared instantly. "Of course, sir. Again, my apologies." But Lawson wasn't finished. The growing audience fueled his performance. "Look at you, can barely walk without falling over. What are you even doing here?" "My grandson has a medical appointment," Ezra replied, voice growing quieter rather than louder. I don't care what your excuse is." Lawson stepped closer, forcing Ezra to look up. "People like you are exactly what's wrong with this country. Weak, useless, taking up space that belongs to real Americans who actually serve." The words hit like physical blows. Tommy's hands clenched into fists, his sense of justice warring with his grandfather's teaching about avoiding confrontation. "Don't turn your back when I'm talking to you." The shove came without warning. Lawson's hands connected with Ezra's chest, sending him stumbling backward. The cane clattered as Ezra fought for balance. Arms windmilling desperately, the cart caught his legs, and he went down hard, shoulder striking metal with a sickening sound. "Grandpa." Tommy dropped beside him, hands hovering uncertainly, afraid to cause more damage but desperate to help. From 3 aisles away, Petty Officer Sarah Chen moved closer. What she saw made her stomach clench. A uniformed officer standing over an elderly man struggling to sit up, clearly dazed, but something else caught her attention. As Ezra pushed himself up, his movements were economical, precise. He checked for injury with systematic thoroughness, eyes automatically scanning for threats, even while accepting Tommy's help as his sleeve rode up. Chen glimpsed what looked like a faded tattoo's edge. It was the walk of someone trained to maintain composure under pressure. The drive home passed in loaded silence, broken only by tire whispers and the old Ford's gentle hum. Tommy pressed against the passenger door, his young face stormy with confusion and anger as Ezra navigated familiar streets with careful attention. His left shoulder ached where it struck the cart, but he kept movement steady, unwilling to add to his grandson's distress. "You didn't do anything wrong," Tommy finally exploded, voice cracking with emotion. "He just pushed you for no reason." Ezra glanced at his grandson, seeing tears threatening to spill. "Sometimes people have bad days, son. Sometimes they take those feelings out on others. But that's not fair." "No," Ezra agreed quietly. It's not. They pulled into their modest ranch house driveway, home for 3 years since the accident that took Tommy's parents and left an elderly man raising a grieving boy. The house was small but meticulously maintained, lawn cut with military precision, flower beds weeded with the same attention Ezra brought to everything. Inside, Tommy threw himself onto the couch while Ezra moved to the kitchen. Routine unchanged by afternoon events. He filled the kettle, set it on the stove, began careful meal preparation. His movements were economical, practiced, habits of someone who'd learned to maximize limited resources. "Grandpa," Tommy watched from the couch, anger giving way to different pain. "Yes, son. Why didn't you fight back?" The question hung between them. Ezra paused in meal preparation, hands resting on the counter as he considered his answer. What would fighting back have accomplished? He would have known he couldn't push you around. Ezra turned to face his grandson directly. "And then what? Would I have felt better? Would you have learned something valuable about handling conflict?" "But you're stronger than him," Tommy protested. "I've seen you move concrete blocks. You fix things with bare hands. You're not weak." The observation was accurate. Despite age and careful movement protecting arthritic joints, Ezra retained surprising strength. His hands were scarred and calloused from decades of hard work, shoulders still broad beneath the cardigan, hiding evidence of a more physical past. "Physical strength and wisdom aren't the same thing," Ezra said gently. "Sometimes the strongest thing is walking away." After dinner, Tommy retreated to homework, while Ezra followed evening routines. He checked locks, not with paranoid fear, but systematic thoroughness of someone for whom security was deeply ingrained habit. He straightened already. Neat rooms, attention to detail reflecting standards beyond simple cleanliness. In his bedroom, he opened the dresser's top drawer and withdrew dog tags hanging from a simple chain. The metal was worn smooth from decades of handling, stamped information still legible despite years. He studied them as he did every evening, then carefully returned them to hiding. Beside the tags lay a wooden box containing items Tommy had never seen. Medals wrapped in tissue, photographs of uniformed young men from a different era, letters bearing official seals few civilians ever received. Ezra closed the drawer without disturbing these memories. Later, as Tommy prepared for bed, he lingered outside his grandfather's room. Through the partially open door, he saw Ezra sitting on his bed's edge, rolling shoulders and moving arms with slow, careful stretches, managing chronic pain. "Does it hurt?" Tommy asked softly. Ezra looked up, face softening with affection for the boy carrying too much worry. "Old bones complain sometimes. Nothing to worry about." "Will we see him again?" The question carried weight beyond simple words. Tommy's medical appointments were regular, bringing them into contact with the military community, whether wanted or not. "Probably," Ezra said honestly, "but we'll handle it with dignity and self-respect." Tommy nodded. Though struggling with strength concepts that didn't involve fighting back 20 miles away, Petty Officer Sarah Chen sat at her kitchen table, laptop open, dinner growing cold as she stared at the screen. She'd been researching all evening, following hunches she couldn't articulate. The old man triggered memory, not specific recollection, but recognition, going beyond their encounter. 12 years of service had taught her to recognize subtle signs marking someone who'd worn the uniform, but database searches revealed nothing. Ezra Whitmore was listed as civilian contractor, authorized for base access to accompany his grandson to medical appointments. No service record, no military history. Yet Chen couldn't shake feelings of missing something important. Something wasn't adding up. Tuesday morning brought another medical appointment, another navigation of Norfolk Naval Base's complex social dynamics. Tommy's quarterly pediatrician checkup, routine follow-up on minor learning disabilities emerging after parental trauma. Ezra scheduled for the least busy time, hoping to avoid crowds and confrontation possibilities. But approaching the medical facility's entrance, careful planning proved insufficient. Commander Lawson stood near the building with 3 junior officers, conversation loud and animated about weekend plans. Ezra recognized the voice before seeing the man, steps slowing involuntarily. "We can wait," he murmured to Tommy, nodding toward a distant bench. "Give them time to finish." But Tommy spotted the group and felt his grandfather's hesitation. Saturday's humiliation flared bright in his 12-year-old chest. "Why should we wait? We have an appointment." "Sometimes patience prevents problems, son. Sometimes people need standing up to," Tommy replied. Echoing recent arguments before Ezra could respond, Lawson's voice carried across the courtyard. "Well, well, look who's back." The officers turned, attention focusing on the elderly man and boy approaching. Lawson's smile held no warmth, only predatory satisfaction finding new prey. "Didn't learn your lesson last time, old man." Ezra continued walking, pace steady despite growing tension. "We have a medical appointment. So we'll be out of your way shortly." "Medical appointment." Lawson stepped directly into their path, forcing them to stop. "What's wrong? Did you hurt yourself falling the other day?" Junior officers laughed, not with genuine amusement, but nervous energy of subordinates feeling obligated to appreciate superior humor. Lieutenant Morrison shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. "Excuse us, please," Ezra said quietly, attempting to step around. "I'm talking to you." Lawson blocked their path again. "You civilians need respect lessons when you're on my base." "Your base!" The words slipped out before Ezra could stop them, carrying familiarity with military protocol and chain of command. Lawson's eyes narrowed. "That's right, my base. People like you don't belong here. Taking resources meant for real servicemen." "My grandson receives treatment through dependent benefits," Ezra replied levelly despite provocation. "We have every right." "Rights," Lawson laughed harshly. "How about military personnel's right not having their day disrupted by clumsy old men who can't stay out of the way?" A small crowd gathered. Medical personnel heading to work. Families arriving for appointments. Base personnel drawn by raised voices. Ezra was acutely aware of attention. Tommy's growing distress, and his own body unconsciously shifting into defensive posture. "Please," he said quietly, "we're just trying to reach our appointment. Please," Lawson mimicked in high, whining voice. "Look, everyone, this is what happens when society goes soft. Old men who beg instead of standing up." Tommy's hands clenched into fists. "Don't talk to my grandpa that way," the outburst delighted Lawson. "The boy has more backbone than the old man. At least someone in your family isn't completely worthless." "That's enough," Morrison found his courage. "Sir, maybe you should mind your business, Lieutenant," Lawson snapped, "unless you want to explain to your commanding officer why you're interfering with proper military discipline." Morrison fell silent, but discomfort was obvious to everyone watching. Across the courtyard, other personnel stopped observing, faces reflecting disgust and uncertainty about intervention. Petty Officer Chen emerged from the medical building just as Lawson stepped closer to Ezra, close enough that the elderly man tilted his head back, maintaining eye contact. "You know your problem, old man. You've forgotten what it means to be a man. You shuffle around like some victim, expecting everyone's pity." Ezra's response was barely audible. "I'm sorry you feel that way, sir." He reached out and pushed Ezra backward, not hard enough to knock down, but firmly enough to make him stumble. Tommy immediately moved to steady his grandfather, young face flushed with angry tears. "Stop it!" Tommy shouted. "Just stop it! He never did anything to you." Chen watched with growing anger, but something else bothered her. As Ezra regained balance, she noticed his movement, subtle stance shifts speaking of training, eyes automatically identifying exits and threats, controlled breathing suggesting high-stress experience, and when Lawson pushed again, harder this time, Chen saw something that made her breath catch. As Ezra's sleeve rode up during his balance attempt, she caught clear glimpse of his forearm tattoo. Not just any tattoo, but the distinctive sealed trident shape, faded but unmistakable to anyone familiar with Navy Special Operations insignia. This wasn't just elderly civilian bullying. This was a veteran, possibly combat veteran, possibly Special Operations, being humiliated by someone with no idea who he was dealing with. The medical appointment passed without incident, but Tommy remained unusually quiet during the drive home. Ezra could feel the questions building in his grandson like pressure in a steam kettle, and he knew that eventually they would need to have a conversation he had been avoiding for 3 years. That evening, while Ezra prepared dinner with his usual methodical precision, Tommy finally exploded, "Why don't you ever fight back?" The question came with all the pent-up frustration of a 12-year-old who couldn't understand why the strongest person in his world seemed to accept being treated like the weakest. Ezra continued stirring the sauce for their spaghetti, considering his words carefully. "What do you think fighting back would accomplish?" "He would stop." Tommy slammed his fist on the kitchen table. "He would know he can't just push you around." "And then what?" Then, Tommy struggled to articulate something beyond his immediate anger. "Then people would respect you." Ezra turned from the stove to face his grandson directly. "Do you respect me less because I don't fight?" The question caught Tommy off guard. "No, that's not. I just don't understand why you let him do that to you." "Come here, son." Tommy approached reluctantly. Still radiating frustration, Ezra pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down so they could speak at eye level. "There are different kinds of strength," Ezra said quietly. "The kind that breaks things, and the kind that builds them, the kind that wins fights, and the kind that prevents them. But he's hurting you." "His words can only hurt me if I give them that power," Ezra replied. "And his actions? Well, they say more about him than they do about me." Tommy's eyes filled with tears of confusion and helplessness. "I don't understand. You're not weak. I've seen you lift things that 2 men couldn't move. I've watched you fix engines and build furniture and you know things. You know how to do everything." The observation was more accurate than Tommy realized. Over the past 3 years, he had indeed watched his grandfather demonstrate knowledge and skills that seemed unusual for a man his age. Ezra could read weather patterns like a farmer, navigate by the stars like a sailor, and assess people's injuries with medical precision. He knew how to fix anything mechanical, how to grow food in their small garden, and how to prepare for any kind of emergency. Knowing how to do something and choosing to do it are different things, Ezra said gently. "But when is it okay to fight back?" The question struck at the heart of everything Ezra had been trying to teach his grandson without revealing too much about where that wisdom had come from. "When someone truly innocent is in danger," he said finally. "When walking away means letting someone else get hurt. When the alternative to fighting is something worse than fighting. What if he hurts you? Then I'll deal with it. But what if he really hurts you?" "What if?" Tommy's voice broke. "I can't lose you too, Grandpa." The admission hung between them like a bridge finally built across a chasm of unspoken fears. Ezra pulled his grandson into a hug, feeling the boy's thin shoulders shake with suppressed sobs. "You're not going to lose me," he promised. "Not to some angry man with hurt feelings and a uniform that gives him more authority than wisdom." "But how do you know?" Ezra hesitated. Knowing that his answer would either comfort Tommy or lead to more questions he wasn't ready to handle. "Because I've dealt with men like him before," he said finally. "And I've learned that the best way to handle a bully is to not become one yourself." 20 minutes later, while Tommy worked on homework at the kitchen table, Ezra stepped outside to water the garden. The evening air was cool and clean, carrying the familiar scents of salt water and military fuel that marked their proximity to the naval base. As he moved among the precisely planted rows of vegetables, Ezra allowed himself a moment of honest assessment. The encounters with Lawson were escalating, becoming more public and more aggressive. Eventually, the man would push too hard, and Ezra's carefully maintained cover would slip. He had spent 3 years building a quiet life with Tommy, creating a safe space where a traumatized boy could heal and grow without the complications of his grandfather's history. But that safety was being threatened by someone who saw weakness where wisdom actually lived. Ezra had survived much worse than Derek Lawson. He had endured interrogation, combat, and losses that would break most men. But he had never faced the particular challenge of protecting his cover while protecting his grandson. Inside the house, Tommy struggled with algebra problems while wrestling with questions that had no mathematical solutions. His grandfather was the strongest person he knew, yet he allowed himself to be treated like the weakest. The contradiction made no sense to a 12-year-old mind that saw the world in terms of right and wrong, strong and weak, fair and unfair. Meanwhile, across town, Petty Officer Sarah Chen sat at her computer following leads that shouldn't exist for a civilian contractor named Ezra Whitmore. Her research had revealed some interesting gaps in the public records, periods where no documentation existed for a man who should have been paying taxes, receiving mail, or leaving some trace of civilian existence. But more importantly, her careful examination of photographs from today's incident had confirmed what she thought she'd seen. The tattoo on Ezra's forearm was definitely military in origin, and the partial keychain insignia she'd managed to photograph matched elements used by naval special operations units. Chen had served long enough to know that some veterans preferred to keep their service private. But there was something about this situation that went beyond normal discretion. The systematic way that Ezra Whitmore had been erased from military records suggested official involvement, the kind of classification that came with specialized assignments and sensitive operations. She was looking at either an elaborate fraud or a legitimate veteran whose service had been deliberately obscured and given the man's behavior under pressure. Chen was betting on the latter. The question was, what kind of veteran needed that level of secrecy, and what would happen if Commander Lawson's harassment forced that secret into the open? Thursday brought an unexpected summons for Petty Officer Chen to report to Chief Rodriguez's office. Rodriguez was a 15-year veteran with the kind of weathered face and steady demeanor that marked someone who had seen enough of military life to understand its complexities without being cynical about its possibilities. "Close the door, Chen." His voice carried the weight of serious business. Chen complied, then took the offered seat across from Rodriguez's desk. She had prepared herself for this conversation, knowing that her research into Ezra Whitmore's background might have triggered official attention. "You've been asking questions about a civilian contractor," Rodriguez said without preamble. "Ezra Whitmore." "Yes, Chief. I witnessed what I believed to be inappropriate treatment of an elderly man by a superior officer. I was trying to determine if there were any factors that might be relevant to how the situation should be handled." Rodriguez studied her face for a long moment. What kind of factors? Chen had rehearsed this moment, knowing that her next words could either validate her suspicions or end her involvement in the situation entirely. "I believe Mr. Whitmore may be a veteran. Chief, his behavior under stress, his physical bearing, and certain visual indicators suggest possible military background that isn't reflected in his official records. Visual indicators. A tattoo that appears to match naval special operations insignia, and personal items that suggest military service." Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And why does this matter to you, Petty Officer?" "Because if he is a veteran, sir, then Commander Lawson's treatment of him isn't just inappropriate. It's a violation of everything we're supposed to stand for regarding how we treat our own." The words hung in the air between them. Rodriguez had served long enough to know that Chen's concerns were valid, regardless of the specifics of Whitmore's background. "I'm going to ask you to suspend your research," Rodriguez said finally. "But not because you're wrong to be concerned." Chen felt her pulse quicken. "Sir, I'm going to pass your concerns up the chain of command to someone with the proper clearance to investigate further. If your suspicions are correct, then this situation needs to be handled by people with access to information that you and I don't have. And if my suspicions are wrong, then an elderly man is still being harassed by an officer who should know better. And that problem still needs to be addressed." Rodriguez picked up his phone and dialed an extension that Chen didn't recognize. "Captain Hayes, this is Chief Rodriguez. I need to speak with you about a personnel matter that may require your particular expertise." The conversation that followed was brief and cryptic, full of carefully chosen words that suggested Hayes understood exactly what kind of situation was being discussed. "He'll be here in 20 minutes, Rodriguez said after hanging up. "Chen, I want you to tell Captain Hayes exactly what you told me, but I need you to understand that whatever he decides to do with this information may be classified above your clearance level. Understood?" "Sir?" "And Chen, if your instincts are right about this man, then you may have prevented something that could have had serious consequences for everyone involved." 20 minutes later, Captain Marcus Hayes entered Rodriguez's office with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to handling sensitive situations. At 52, Hayes carried himself with the bearing of a career officer who had seen combat and understood the difference between peacetime politics and actual military necessity. Chen repeated her observations and concerns, noting how Hayes's expression grew increasingly serious as she described the tattoo and Ezra Whitmore's behavior under stress. "You said the name was Ezra Whitmore?" Hayes asked when she finished. "Yes, sir." Hayes was quiet for several moments, his face cycling through what Chen could only describe as shock, recognition, and something that might have been reverence. "Petty Officer Chen, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is not to be discussed with anyone except Chief Rodriguez and myself until I give you explicit permission." "Yes, sir. 30 years ago, I was a young sailor serving in a classified unit. Our training instructor was a Master Chief Petty Officer whose name was Ezra Whitmore." Hayes paused, seeming to gather himself. "That man saved my life and the lives of my entire platoon during an operation that officially never happened." The revelation hit Chen like a physical blow. "Sir, are you saying—" "I'm saying that if the man Commander Lawson has been harassing is the same Ezra Whitmore who trained special operations personnel for 2 decades, and then Lawson has been assaulting one of the most decorated veterans in naval history." Rodriguez whistled softly. "Jesus." "Master Chief Whitmore's service record was classified at the highest levels due to the nature of his assignments," Hayes continued. "After his retirement, he was given a civilian cover identity as part of his security protocol. If your observations are correct, then his cover has remained intact for years." "Until now," Chen said quietly. "Until now," Hayes agreed. "Chief Rodriguez, I need you to pull every piece of documentation about the incidents between Lawson and this civilian contractor, video surveillance, witness statements, everything." "Yes, sir. And Petty Officer Chen, I need you to write a detailed report of everything you've observed, but you're going to submit it directly to me. This doesn't go through normal channels." "Understood, sir." Hayes stood, his decision already made. "If this is who I think it is, then we have a problem that goes far beyond one officer's inappropriate behavior. We have a situation where one of our own, a genuine war hero, has been systematically abused by someone who doesn't have the slightest idea who he's dealing with." "What do you want me to do about Commander Lawson?" Rodriguez asked. "Nothing yet. I need to confirm Mr. Whitmore's identity and understand why his cover is still active before we do anything that might compromise his security." Hayes paused at the door. "But if this is the man I trained under, then Derek Lawson is about to learn a lesson about respect that he'll never forget." After Hayes left, Rodriguez and Chen sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. "Chief," Chen finally asked, "what kind of operations require that level of classification 30 years later?" Rodriguez's expression was grim. "The kind where the people involved did things that officially never happened to protect people who will never know their names. And if it's true, if this man really is, then Commander Lawson has been harassing someone who makes his combat experience look like summer camp," Rodriguez finished. "And Master Chief Whitmore has been taking that abuse without saying a word, because his cover identity is more important to him than his personal dignity." Chen thought about the quiet way Ezra had endured Lawson's harassment. The careful control he maintained even when being physically pushed around. "Why," she asked, "why would someone with that kind of background allow himself to be treated that way?" Rodriguez considered the question carefully. Because real warriors don't need to prove themselves to anyone, he said finally, and because some secrets are worth more than personal pride. Captain Hayes spent Friday morning in secure communications with Pentagon personnel offices that most naval officers didn't even know existed. The conversations were brief, coded, and confirmed his worst fears. Master Chief Petty Officer Ezra Whitmore, retired, was indeed living under civilian cover in the Norfolk area. His security clearance remained active due to his ongoing consultation work with veteran transition services, a role that allowed him to help other classified operatives adjust to civilian life without revealing his own background. The file that Hayes received contained information that made his stomach tighten with rage. Ezra Whitmore had served for 22 years in units whose names were still classified. He had been awarded the Navy Cross for actions during an operation in Southeast Asia that remained officially non-existent, 2 Silver Stars for separate incidents that had saved dozens of American lives, and 3 Purple Hearts for wounds received in service to operations that the public would never know about. More importantly, Master Chief Whitmore had trained over 200 special operations personnel, including Hayes himself. His innovations in underwater demolition, close-quarters combat, and survival training were still being used by SEAL teams today. And for the past month, this genuine American hero had been systematically humiliated by a desk jockey commander whose greatest military achievement was maintaining supply spreadsheets. Hayes's secure phone rang at 1100 hours. "Captain, this is Admiral Richardson at Nav Specwalcom. I understand you've identified Master Chief Whitmore." "Yes, sir, and I understand why his cover needs to be maintained. But we have a problem." "Admiral," Hayes explained the situation with Commander Lawson, describing the escalating harassment and the public nature of the incidents. Richardson's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes about his reaction to the news. "Captain, I served with Ezra Whitmore in 1983. That man pulled me and 6 others out of a situation that should have killed us all. If some peacetime asshole is harassing him, it gets worse, sir. The harassment is happening in front of his grandson, a 12-year-old boy that Whitmore is raising. The profanity that came through the secure line was both unprintable and heartfelt. Captain Hayes, you are hereby authorized to take any action necessary to resolve this situation. Master Chief Whitmore has given more to this country than most people ever dream of, and he deserves better than this shit." "Sir, what about his cover?" "Whitmore's cover identity expires next month anyway. He's been planning to transition back to normal veteran status now that his grandson is more settled. This just accelerates the timeline." Hayes felt a surge of satisfaction. "Understood, sir. I have a plan." "Good, and Captain, when you handle Commander Lawson, make sure it's educational. That son of a bitch needs to learn exactly who he's been fucking with." Saturday morning brought another routine trip to the base for Ezra and Tommy. This time to pick up a prescription from the base pharmacy. Ezra had hoped to make the visit quick and quiet, but as they approached the main commissary building, he spotted the familiar group of officers that had become his weekly torment. Commander Lawson was holding court with several junior officers, his voice carrying across the parking lot as he regaled them with stories of his weekend plans. Ezra hesitated, considering whether to wait in the car until the group moved on. But Tommy had already spotted them. "Come on, Grandpa, we can't let him control where we go." The words carried wisdom beyond Tommy's 12 years, and Ezra felt a surge of pride for the boy's courage. "You're right, son. We have as much right to be here as anyone." But as they approached the building entrance, Lawson's voice grew louder and more pointed. "And then, this old fool can't even handle pushing a shopping cart without running into people. I swear, they'll give base access to anyone these days." The comments were clearly intended to be overheard. Ezra kept walking, his pace steady and his eyes focused ahead, but Tommy's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "He's talking about us," Tommy whispered. "Let him talk," Ezra replied quietly. "His words say more about him than they do about us." But Lawson wasn't finished as they reached the building entrance. He stepped directly into their path with a smile that held no warmth. Well, if it isn't our favorite clumsy civilian and his little sidekick. This time, there was no pretense of accident or misunderstanding. Lawson had positioned himself and his audience for maximum impact, creating a public spectacle that would humiliate Ezra in front of the largest possible crowd. "Good morning, sir," Ezra said politely, attempting to step around the group. "Where do you think you're going, old man?" "To the pharmacy, sir. We have a prescription to pick up." "Prescription?" Lawson's voice rose mockingly. "What for?" "Medication to help you walk without falling down." The junior officers laughed nervously, their discomfort obvious to everyone except Lawson himself. Across the courtyard, other personnel had stopped to watch the confrontation, some with obvious disgust at the officer's behavior. "Please, sir, we're just trying to—" "You're trying to what? Take up space that belongs to real military families, use resources meant for people who actually serve this country." Tommy stepped forward, his young voice shaking with anger. "My grandpa served. He was in the Navy." The lie came instinctively, born from a 12-year-old's desperate need to defend the man he loved most in the world, but it hit closer to the truth than anyone in the crowd could possibly know. Lawson laughed harshly. "Really? What was his rate? What ships did he serve on? Where are his discharge papers?" Tommy looked back at his grandfather, expecting support for his claim, but Ezra's face had gone carefully neutral. "Son, it's not important." "It is important." Tommy turned back to Lawson with tears in his eyes. "He's the best man I know. He's strong and smart, and he takes care of me, and he would never hurt anyone the way you hurt people." The outburst created a moment of silence that stretched across the entire courtyard. In that silence, something shifted in the watching crowd's expression. Tommy's fierce defense of his grandfather had highlighted the vast disparity between a child's love and an adult's cruelty. But Lawson seemed energized by the boy's distress. "Strong, smart, look at him, kid. He can barely stand up straight without a cane. He's exactly the kind of weak—" "That's enough." The voice came from behind the crowd, carrying an authority that made everyone turn. Captain Hayes approached with the measured stride of someone accustomed to command, his expression carefully controlled but clearly dangerous. "Captain Hayes." Lawson straightened, suddenly aware that his performance had attracted high-level attention. "Sir, You were just what, Commander?" Hayes's voice carried the kind of quiet menace that made experienced military personnel step back involuntarily. This civilian and his grandson were attempting to enter the building. "Sir, I was ensuring they understood proper protocol for..." "For what? Shopping at a commissary they're legally authorized to use." Hayes approached Ezra, his demeanor shifting to something approaching reverence as he got closer. "Sir, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine, thank you," Ezra replied, but Hayes noticed the way the older man was studying his face with the careful attention of someone trying to place a half-remembered acquaintance. "Commander Lawson," Hayes said without taking his eyes off Ezra, "you're dismissed. Report to my office at 800 Monday morning." "Sir, I don't understand." "You're dismissed, Commander." The tone left no room for argument. Lawson gathered his humiliated entourage and retreated, leaving Hayes, Ezra, and Tommy standing in the sudden quiet of the courtyard. "Sir," Hayes said to Ezra, "might I have a word with you privately?" Ezra looked at Tommy, then back at Hayes. Something in the captain's demeanor suggested this conversation would be different from the others they'd endured. "Tommy, why don't you go pick up that prescription? I'll wait here with the captain." Tommy hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave his grandfather alone with another uniformed officer, but Ezra's gentle nod convinced him to comply. When the boy was out of earshot, Hayes stepped closer to Ezra and spoke quietly. "Master Chief." The title hit Ezra like an electric shock. After 3 years of careful civilian anonymity, being recognized was both his greatest fear and his deepest relief. "I think you have me confused with someone else." "Captain, do I? Because 30 years ago, Master Chief Petty Officer Ezra Whitmore taught me that true strength comes from knowing when not to use it." Hayes's voice carried a mixture of respect and barely controlled anger. "He also taught me that some people mistake restraint for weakness, usually right before they learn exactly how wrong they are." Ezra's cover was blown, and they both knew it. The question now was whether the revelation would destroy the quiet life he'd built with Tommy, or finally allow him to stop pretending to be less than he was. "Captain, my grandson doesn't know about my service," Ezra said quietly. "That was always the point of the cover." "I understand, Master Chief, but the cover's blown anyway, and that grandson of yours just defended your honor in front of half the base personnel. Maybe it's time he learned that his hero is an actual hero." Hayes paused, studying Ezra's face. "Besides, sir, Commander Lawson needs to understand exactly who he's been messing with, and frankly, so does everyone else who witnessed his performance. What do you have in mind?" "Captain," for the first time in the conversation, Hayes smiled. "Something educational, Master Chief, something very educational." Monday morning brought a base-wide formation that hadn't been scheduled on any official calendar. Word spread through Norfolk Naval Base like wildfire. All available personnel were to report to the main parade ground at 1,000 hours for a special ceremony honoring a distinguished veteran. Commander Lawson arrived at Captain Hayes's office at 800 as ordered, expecting a routine disciplinary meeting about his treatment of civilians. What he found instead was a room full of senior officers, including several he didn't recognize, who wore the kind of quiet authority that suggested special operations backgrounds. "Commander Lawson," Hayes began without preamble, "you're going to learn something today about the difference between rank and respect, between authority and honor, and between the uniform you wear and the man you are underneath it." "Sir, I don't understand." "Sit down and listen, Commander. Your education is about to begin." Hayes activated a wall monitor that displayed a classified military service record. Lawson read the name at the top and felt his stomach drop through the floor. "Master Chief Petty Officer Ezra Whitmore, retired," Hayes announced to the room. 22 years of service in units whose names are still classified. Navy Cross for actions during Operation Silent Thunder. 2 Silver Stars for separate incidents involving the rescue of American personnel under hostile fire. 3 Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat. The record that appeared on the screen made Lawson's own service look like a weekend camping trip. Operation after operation, classification after classification, a career spent in shadows, protecting people who would never know his name. "The man you've been harassing for the past month," Hayes continued, trained over 200 special operations personnel, including myself and 3 other officers in this room. His innovations in underwater demolition and close-quarters combat are still being taught to SEAL teams today." Lawson's face had gone pale. "Sir, I had no idea." "Of course you didn't, because Master Chief Whitmore was living under a civilian cover identity as part of his post-service security protocol, a cover that was designed to protect him and his family from potential retaliation by enemies of the United States." Hayes leaned forward, his voice dropping to a level that made everyone in the room lean closer to hear. "Which means, Commander, that your harassment of an apparently helpless old man was actually harassment of someone who could have killed you with his bare hands before you finished saying, 'Good morning.'" The silence in the room was absolute. "But here's the truly educational part, Lawson. Master Chief Whitmore never once considered retaliating against you, never once lost his temper, never once used his considerable skills to defend himself. Do you know why? No, sir. Because real warriors don't need to prove themselves to people who wouldn't understand the proof anyway." Hayes stood and walked to the window overlooking the parade ground, where hundreds of personnel were gathering for the ceremony. "You're going to march out there in 10 minutes, Commander. You're going to stand in front of this entire base and formally apologize to Master Chief Whitmore for your treatment of him. Then you're going to listen while his actual service record is read aloud to everyone who watched you humiliate him. Sir, your career's over anyway, Lawson. You're facing court-martial for harassment of a veteran, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The only question now is whether you handle this with some dignity or make it worse for yourself." Hayes turned back to face the room. "Master Chief Whitmore earned his retirement, earned his peace, and earned the right to live quietly with his grandson without interference from people who mistake authority for strength. You violated all of that. What happens to me, sir? That depends on Master Chief Whitmore, Hayes replied. He has the right to press formal charges that could send you to military prison, or he might choose to let your public humiliation and dismissal from service be punishment enough. Hayes checked his watch. Either way, you're about to learn what it feels like to be the one standing alone in front of a hostile crowd. At 1,000 hours, the entire available personnel of Norfolk Naval Base stood in formation on the main parade ground. Word had spread quickly about the nature of the ceremony, and the mood in the ranks was electric with anticipation and anger. Everyone had heard about Commander Lawson's treatment of the elderly civilian, and most had found it distasteful even before learning the victim's true identity. Ezra Whitmore stood at the front of the formation with Tommy beside him, both wearing their best civilian clothes, but somehow looking more military than most of the uniformed personnel behind them. Tommy had spent the weekend learning about his grandfather's true history, his shock and pride, creating a complex mixture of emotions that were still settling into understanding. Captain Hayes took the podium with the kind of authority that commanded immediate attention. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to correct an injustice and to honor a man who has served our nation with distinction for over 2 decades. But before we proceed with that honor, we must first address the injustice. Hayes gestured to Lawson, who approached the podium with obvious reluctance. His uniform was immaculate as always, but his face carried the pallor of someone facing personal and professional destruction. Commander Lawson has something to say. Lawson stepped to the microphone, his voice barely audible as he began to speak. Master Chief Whitmore, sir, I owe you an apology. Louder, Commander, Hayes instructed coldly. Master Chief Whitmore, Lawson repeated, his voice now carrying across the parade ground. I apologize for my treatment of you over the past month. I was wrong to harass you, wrong to push you, and wrong to humiliate you in front of your grandson and our fellow service members. The formal words sounded hollow, coming from someone who clearly didn't understand their full meaning. But they served their purpose in acknowledging the wrong that had been done. I had no idea of your service record or your sacrifices for our country, Lawson continued, but that's no excuse for the way I treated you. You deserved respect regardless of your background, and I failed to provide that respect. He paused, clearly struggling with what came next. I request your forgiveness, sir, and I accept whatever consequences my actions have earned. Lawson stepped back from the microphone and waited for Ezra's response. The entire base held its breath as the elderly man approached the podium, moving slowly but with unmistakable dignity. Commander Lawson, Ezra said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent formation. I accept your apology. The simplicity of the response surprised everyone, including Lawson himself. I won't press formal charges against you, Ezra continued, not because you don't deserve them, but because I believe in giving people the chance to learn from their mistakes and become better than they were. He paused, studying Lawson's face. I hope you'll use this experience to remember that every person you encounter has a story you don't know. Battles you haven't seen, and worth that isn't measured by their uniform or their rank. The grace of Ezra's response created a ripple of emotion through the watching crowd. This was leadership in its purest form, strength without cruelty, authority without arrogance, justice without vengeance. Hayes returned to the podium as Lawson retreated into the formation. Now, let us properly honor Master Chief Petty Officer Ezra Whitmore for his service to our nation. What followed was 20 minutes of military history that few civilians would ever hear. Hayes read portions of Ezra's classified service record that had been cleared for public release, detailing missions that sounded like fiction, but represented real sacrifices made by a real man who had never sought recognition for them. As the citation for the Navy Cross was read aloud, describing how then-Chief Petty Officer Whitmore had single-handedly held off enemy forces while his team evacuated wounded personnel, Tommy looked up at his grandfather with a mixture of awe and understanding that would change their relationship forever. The final surprise came when 3 other senior officers stepped forward, men who had served under Ezra's command in various classified units and who had flown in specifically for this ceremony. "Master Chief Whitmore," announced Commander James Mitchell, now assigned to Pentagon's Special Projects. "I served under your command in 1987. You saved my life and the lives of 12 other men during an operation that I still can't discuss publicly. I just wanted you to know that we never forgot, and we never will." Similar testimonies followed from the other officers, each one adding weight to the growing understanding of exactly who Ezra Whitmore was and what his quiet service had meant to countless people over the years. When the ceremony concluded, the formation dispersed slowly, with many personnel approaching Ezra to shake his hand or simply to thank him for his service. Tommy watched this with growing pride and a new understanding of why his grandfather had taught him that real strength didn't need to prove itself through violence. Commander Lawson remained at attention until the very end, then approached Ezra one final time. "Master Chief," he said quietly, "I know my apology can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my career remembering this lesson." Ezra studied the younger man's face and saw something that might eventually develop into wisdom. "See that you do, Commander, and remember that the uniform you wear represents everyone who wore it before you. Try to be worthy of that honor." As they walked back to their car, Tommy slipped his hand into his grandfather's with a gesture that carried new meaning. "Grandpa." "Yes, son. I'm proud of you, not because of the medals or the operations or any of that stuff. I'm proud of you because you taught that man how to be better instead of just punishing him for being wrong." Ezra smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "That's the most important lesson I ever learned in the military, Tommy. Sometimes the greatest victory is turning an enemy into someone better than they were." The aftermath of the ceremony rippled through Norfolk Naval Base like stones dropped in still water, creating waves that reached far beyond the immediate participants. Within hours, word had spread throughout the Navy's Special Operations community that Master Chief Ezra Whitmore had finally been properly recognized after years of anonymous civilian life. Commander Lawson's dismissal from the service proceeded swiftly but without vindictiveness. The formal charges that could have sent him to military prison were dropped in accordance with Ezra's wishes. But his career was effectively over. The officer who had built his authority on dominating those he perceived as weaker now faced the reality of civilian life where such tactics held no power for Ezra and Tommy. The revelation created both opportunities and challenges. The end of his cover identity meant that Ezra could finally be honest about his past, but it also meant adjusting to a new relationship dynamic where Tommy knew his grandfather as both the gentleman who had raised him and the warrior who had served his country in ways most people would never understand. "I have questions," Tommy announced on their first evening back to normal life, sitting across from his grandfather at the dinner table where they had shared hundreds of meals without discussing the most significant aspects of Ezra's life. "I imagine you do," Ezra replied, setting down his fork and giving his grandson his full attention. "Ask whatever you want to know. Were you ever scared?" The question was simpler and more profound than the military details Tommy might have asked. It spoke to the heart of what a 12-year-old needed to understand about courage and fear. "Every time," Ezra answered honestly. "Being scared isn't the opposite of being brave. Being brave is doing what needs to be done despite being scared." "Did you ever have to kill people?" Ezra had prepared himself for this question, knowing that Tommy needed an honest answer without graphic details that would create new nightmares. "Yes," he said quietly, "but only when there was no other choice, and only to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." "Does that make you sad?" The perception in the question revealed how well Tommy understood his grandfather's essential nature, despite learning about his military service. The boy recognized that Ezra's fundamental character was built on protecting rather than destroying. "It makes me sad that the world sometimes requires such choices," Ezra replied. "But I'm not sorry for protecting people who needed protection." Tommy nodded, processing this information against everything he had observed about his grandfather's character over the past 3 years. "Is that why you didn't fight back against Commander Lawson? Because you knew you could hurt him?" "Partly," Ezra admitted, "but mostly because fighting him wouldn't have accomplished anything positive. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is show someone a better way to be, like you did at the ceremony." Exactly like that. They finished dinner in comfortable silence, both of them adjusting to a new reality where honesty replaced the careful omissions that had shaped their previous conversations. Later that evening, Ezra retrieved the wooden box from his bedroom drawer and brought it to the living room where Tommy waited with obvious curiosity. "These are things I wasn't allowed to share before," Ezra said, opening the box to reveal the medals, photographs, and letters that documented a career spent in shadow. "But they're part of who I am, and you have a right to know about them." Tommy examined each item with the careful attention he brought to everything important, asking questions about the people in photographs and the meaning behind various decorations. But what interested him most wasn't the evidence of his grandfather's heroism. It was the letters from other veterans thanking Ezra for his help in transitioning to civilian life. "You still help soldiers?" Tommy asked, reading a particularly moving letter from a former SEAL who credited Ezra with saving his life after his return from Afghanistan. "When I can," Ezra replied. "It's different from the old work, but it's still important." "Is that why you had to keep it secret? So you could help other people who needed to keep secrets too?" The question demonstrated understanding that surprised Ezra with its sophistication. "That's exactly right. Some veterans need time to figure out how to be civilians again. And they need help from people who understand what they've been through. And now that everyone knows about you, can you still help them?" "We'll figure that out," Ezra said. "There are different ways to help people." The next few weeks brought unexpected changes to their routine. Veterans from around the region began reaching out to Ezra, some seeking advice, others simply wanting to thank him for his service. The Norfolk Veterans Administration asked him to speak at their monthly meetings, and several military historians requested interviews about operations that were finally being declassified. But perhaps the most significant change was Tommy's new perspective on the lessons his grandfather had been teaching him all along. The patience, the restraint, the emphasis on building rather than breaking, these weren't just philosophical preferences, but practical wisdom earned through decades of experience in situations where the wrong choice could cost lives. Captain Hayes became a regular visitor to their home, often bringing other veterans who had served under Ezra's command and wanted to reconnect with their former instructor. These visits created a bridge between Ezra's military past and his civilian present, allowing him to maintain connections with his former life while building new ones around his current identity. "You know," Hayes said during one evening visit, watching Ezra help Tommy with algebra homework, "I always wondered what happened to you after retirement, seeing who you became as a grandfather. It makes perfect sense." "How so?" Ezra asked, not looking up from Tommy's math problems. "Because teaching someone to be a good person is the hardest mission there is, and you were always our best instructor." Tommy looked up from his homework. "Captain Hayes, were you scared when you learned from my grandpa?" Hayes laughed. "Terrified, but that was the point. Master Chief Whitmore taught us that fear keeps you alive if you learn to work with it instead of against it. Is that why he wasn't scared of Commander Lawson?" "Your grandfather wasn't unafraid of Lawson," Hayes corrected gently. "He was afraid of what fighting back might teach you about how to handle problems. Turns out his fear was smarter than Lawson's anger." These conversations helped Tommy understand that his grandfather's military service and his role as a caregiver weren't separate aspects of his character, but different expressions of the same fundamental commitment to protecting and nurturing others. School became easier for Tommy as well. Word of his grandfather's service had spread through his peer group, creating a new social dynamic where other students saw him not as the quiet kid with the elderly guardian, but as someone with a genuinely heroic family story. But more importantly, Tommy found that he was better able to handle conflicts with other students, using the lessons about strength and restraint that now made complete sense in their full context. "There's this kid who keeps picking on smaller kids at lunch," Tommy told his grandfather one evening, "and I know I could stop him, but I keep thinking about what you said about real strength." "What do you think real strength would look like in that situation?" Tommy considered the question carefully. "Maybe talking to a teacher, or maybe just sitting with the kids he picks on, so they're not alone." "Why do you think those would be strong responses?" "Because they actually solve the problem instead of just creating a different problem." Ezra smiled with the satisfaction of a teacher whose most important lesson had finally been understood. "Exactly right. Fighting the bully might make you feel better, but it doesn't protect the kids he'll pick on when you're not around." "But what if he won't stop? What if talking doesn't work and teachers can't help?" "Then you use exactly as much force as necessary to protect innocent people, and no more, like you did with your soldiers, like I did with my soldiers." As autumn settled over Norfolk, Ezra and Tommy established new routines that incorporated both his revealed military history and their ongoing civilian life. Sunday dinners often included veteran guests, creating an extended family of people who understood service and sacrifice in ways that enriched Tommy's education about the world beyond their small household. The base commissary, once a source of tension and humiliation, became a place where personnel routinely approached Ezra with respect and gratitude. The transformation was so complete that Tommy sometimes forgot there had ever been a time when visiting the base meant enduring harassment rather than receiving acknowledgement. One evening, as they walked through the commissary together, Tommy noticed how different their experience had become. "Grandpa, do you think Commander Lawson learned anything?" "I hope so. Learning to treat people with dignity isn't something that happens overnight. But everyone deserves the chance to become better than they were. Do you forgive him?" Ezra paused, considering the depth of the question. "I forgave him at the ceremony, son. But forgiveness isn't the same as trust. Forgiveness means I'm not carrying anger about what he did. Trust means believing he won't do it again. What's the difference? Forgiveness is something I do for my own peace of mind. Trust is something that has to be earned through changed behavior over time." As they finished their shopping and headed home, Tommy reflected on how much his understanding of strength, wisdom, and character had evolved since learning about his grandfather's true history. The man who had raised him with gentle patience was indeed the same man who had served in dangerous places and difficult circumstances. But now Tommy understood that these weren't contradictory aspects of his character. They were complementary expressions of the same deep commitment to protecting others. "Grandpa." "Yes, son. I'm glad you're both. The soldier and the grandfather." "Why's that?" "Because now I know that being strong and being kind aren't opposites. They're the same thing, just expressed differently." Ezra reached over and squeezed his grandson's shoulder, understanding that the most important lesson he'd ever taught had finally been learned completely. Winter brought unexpected visitors to the small ranch house where Ezra and Tommy had built their quiet life. The first was Admiral Richardson himself, who made an unannounced visit on a Tuesday afternoon to thank Ezra personally for his decades of service and to discuss opportunities for him to work more openly with veteran transition programs. "Master Chief," Richardson said, accepting a cup of coffee in Ezra's modest living room, "your situation has highlighted some problems in how we handle veteran services. There are others like you, retired special operations personnel who could help transitioning veterans but can't because of classification issues." Ezra listened carefully, understanding that he was being offered a chance to expand his quiet work, helping other veterans, into something more formal and far-reaching. "What did you have in mind, Admiral?" "A consulting position with the Veterans Administration, helping us design programs specifically For veterans transitioning from classified units, your experience, both military and personal, makes you uniquely qualified to understand what these people need. Tommy looked up from his homework at the kitchen table, listening to the conversation with the understanding that this decision would affect both their lives. Would this mean travel? Ezra asked, thinking about his responsibilities as Tommy's guardian. Some, but not extensive. Mostly it would involve reviewing existing programs and developing new protocols that could be implemented regionally. Ezra glanced at Tommy, who gave him an encouraging nod. I'm interested, Admiral, but I need to understand how this would affect my grandson's situation. Actually, that's part of what makes you so valuable for this work. You understand better than most how military service affects families, and how the transition to civilian life impacts everyone in the household, not just the veteran. The conversation continued for another hour, covering details of compensation, security clearances, and the scope of work involved. By the time Admiral Richardson left, Ezra had agreed to a consulting arrangement that would allow him to help other veterans while maintaining his primary focus on raising Tommy. The second significant visitor arrived the following week. Commander Lawson, now dressed in civilian clothes and looking considerably different from the arrogant officer who had once terrorized elderly shoppers at the commissary. Master Chief, Lawson said when Ezra answered the door, I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I was hoping I could speak with you. Ezra studied the younger man's face, noting the changes that 6 months of civilian life had created. The aggressive confidence was gone, replaced by something that might eventually develop into genuine humility. Come in, Ezra said, leading Lawson to the living room. Tommy, this is Mr. Lawson. He used to be Commander Lawson. Tommy looked up from his book with obvious recognition, but his expression held curiosity rather than anger. Hello, sir. Hello, Tommy, Lawson replied, his voice carrying a gentleness that would have been unimaginable during their previous encounters. I owe you an apology, too. You shouldn't have had to watch an adult behave the way I behaved. Tommy considered this seriously. My grandpa says people can learn to be better if they want to. I'm hoping that's true. Ezra gestured for Lawson to sit, then took the chair across from him. What brings you here? I wanted to thank you for not pressing charges, Lawson said, and I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about what happened, trying to understand how I became the kind of person who would harass an elderly man in front of his grandson. What have you concluded? That I confused authority with strength and respect with fear. I thought being tough meant being cruel, and that leadership meant domination. Ezra nodded, recognizing the self-awareness that genuine learning required. Those are easy mistakes to make in military culture if you're not careful about the examples you follow. I've been working with a counselor, Lawson continued, trying to understand the anger I carried and why I took it out on people who didn't deserve it. That takes courage, does it? Because it feels more like the first honest thing I've done in years. They talked for nearly an hour, with Lawson describing his efforts to understand and change the attitudes that had led to his harassment of Ezra. He had taken a job with a non-profit organization that helped disabled veterans find employment, work that was forcing him to confront his prejudices about weakness and worth. I'm not asking for forgiveness again, Lawson said, as he prepared to leave. I know that's not something you can give and take back based on my behavior, but I wanted you to know that your example taught me something important about what real strength looks like, which was that the strongest people I've ever met have been the ones who used their strength to protect others rather than to prove themselves. After Lawson left, Tommy looked thoughtful for several minutes before speaking. Grandpa, do you think he really changed? I think he's trying to change, Ezra replied. Whether he succeeds depends on whether he continues doing the work even when it's difficult. Why did you talk to him? You could have just sent him away, because giving people the chance to apologize properly is sometimes the only way they can learn to be better, and because refusing to listen to someone who's trying to change makes it harder for them to keep changing. Tommy nodded. adding this to his growing understanding of how forgiveness and accountability could work together rather than against each other. Spring brought the official launch of the Veteran Transition Program that Ezra had helped design. The ceremony at the Veterans Administration was small and private, attended mainly by veterans who would benefit from the new services and the professionals who would implement them. But for Ezra, the most meaningful moment came when Tommy was invited to speak about what it meant to be the family member of a veteran transitioning to civilian life. "My grandfather taught me that being strong doesn't mean hurting other people," Tommy told the assembled group. "It means protecting people who need protection and helping people become better than they were. He did that when he was a soldier, and he still does it now as my grandpa." The applause that followed wasn't just appreciation for a 12-year-old speech, but recognition of a lesson that extended far beyond military service into the fundamental question of how strength should be used in all aspects of life. After the ceremony, as Ezra and Tommy walked through downtown Norfolk toward their car, they passed a group of young sailors on shore leave. One of them, barely 18 and obviously new to military life, was being harassed by local teenagers who saw his uniform as a target for their own insecurities. Tommy looked at his grandfather, waiting to see how he would handle this situation that echoed their own experiences from months earlier. Ezra approached the group calmly, but with unmistakable authority. "Gentlemen," he said to the teenagers, "is there a problem here?" His tone wasn't threatening, but it carried the kind of quiet confidence that made the local kids step back and reassess the situation. The young sailor looked relieved to see adult intervention. "This is getting resolved peacefully," Ezra continued, "but it's getting resolved now." The teenagers, faced with someone who clearly wasn't intimidated by their posturing, decided to find entertainment elsewhere. The sailor thanked Ezra profusely, but Ezra waved off his gratitude. "Someone helped me learn that real strength protects people," he told the young man. "Pass it on when you get the chance." As they continued toward their car, Tommy walked with obvious pride beside his grandfather. "Is that how it works?" he asked. "People learn to be better, then they teach other people to be better." "That's exactly how it works," Ezra replied. "That's how good things spread through the world. One person at a time, one choice at a time, one example at a time. And that's why you helped Commander Lawson learn instead of just punishing him. That's why. Punishment might have made me feel better, but it wouldn't have made him better. And making people better is usually more important than making yourself feel better." Tommy considered this as they reached their car. "And Grandpa?" "Yes, son. When I grow up, I want to be strong like you." Ezra smiled, understanding that his grandson had learned the most important lesson anyone could learn, that true strength was measured not by the ability to dominate others, but by the wisdom to use power in service of something larger than oneself. "You already are strong like me, Tommy. You just need to keep choosing to use that strength the right way." As they drove home through the familiar streets of Norfolk, past the naval base where Ezra's journey from anonymous civilian to recognized veteran had unfolded, both grandfather and grandson understood that their story wasn't ending. It was beginning a new chapter where the lessons learned through hardship could be shared with others who needed to understand the difference between power and strength, between authority and leadership, between dominance and protection. The quiet house where they had built their life together would continue to be a sanctuary, but it would also become a place where other veterans and their families could learn what Ezra and Tommy had discovered together, that the strongest people are those who use their strength to help others become stronger, and that the greatest victories are those that transform enemies into allies, conflicts into learning opportunities, and individual growth into community healing. 5 years later, the small ranch house had been expanded with a modest addition that served as an office for the Whitmore Veteran Transition Center. What had begun as Ezra's consulting work with the Veterans Administration had evolved into a comprehensive program that helped former Special Operations personnel and their families navigate the complex process of returning to civilian life. Tommy, now 17 and preparing for his senior year of high school, had grown into a young man who embodied the lessons his grandfather had taught him. Tall and athletic, he possessed the kind of quiet confidence that drew respect rather than demanded it, and his role in helping other military families had taught him leadership skills that no classroom could have provided. "Grandpa, Mrs. Patterson is here with her son," Tommy called from the office, where he helped coordinate the center's activities after school and on weekends. Helen Patterson was the wife of a former Navy SEAL who had been killed in Afghanistan 2 years earlier. Her 16-year-old son Marcus had been struggling with anger and behavioral problems since his father's death, and the family had been referred to the center by their base chaplain. Ezra emerged from the kitchen, where he had been preparing coffee and snacks, a ritual he maintained for all visiting families, understanding that healing often began with simple acts of hospitality. "Mrs. Patterson," he said warmly, extending his hand to a woman whose face showed the strain of raising a difficult teenager while processing her own grief. "And you must be Marcus." Marcus Patterson stood slouched against the office wall, his expression hostile and defensive. At 16, he carried his father's physical build and his mother's dark eyes, but his posture screamed rejection of any adult authority. "Marcus," his mother said with obvious embarrassment, "Mr. Whitmore is trying to help us." "I don't need help," Marcus replied without looking at Ezra. "And I don't need another old man telling me how to live my life." Tommy stepped forward with the ease of someone accustomed to working with angry teenagers. "Hey, Marcus, want to see something cool? My grandfather has a workshop in the back where he's restoring a 1967 Mustang." The offer wasn't random. Tommy had learned that connecting with hostile visitors often required finding something that bypassed their emotional defenses and appealed to their interests. Marcus's posture shifted slightly. "What kind of Mustang?" "Fastback G390, same model as the one in Bullet. Come check it out." As the boys headed toward the workshop, Ezra gestured for Mrs. Patterson to join him in the living room, where they could talk privately, while still keeping an eye on their children through the large windows. "He's been getting into fights at school," Mrs. Patterson began without preamble. "3 suspensions this semester. The counselors say he's acting out because of his father's death. But honestly, Mr. Whitmore, I don't know what to do with him anymore." Ezra had heard variations of this story dozens of times over the past 5 years. Military families faced unique challenges when dealing with loss, especially when that loss involved classified circumstances that couldn't be fully explained or processed through normal grief counseling. "Tell me about his relationship with his father," Ezra said, settling into his chair with the patient attention that had made him effective with both military personnel and their families. "They were very close. David, my husband, took Marcus camping every weekend. Taught him fishing, hunting, all the outdoor stuff. But more than that, they talked. David made sure Marcus understood what service meant, what sacrifice meant. And now Marcus feels like those conversations were lies, because his father died anyway." Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears. "How did you know?" "Because that's the hardest part for military children. Understanding that honor and duty don't guarantee safety or happy endings." Through the window, they could see Tommy explaining the Mustang's restoration process to Marcus, who was now actively engaged and asking questions about the engine specifications. Marcus keeps saying that if his father was such a hero, why isn't he here to help with college applications and dating advice and all the normal father things? Mrs. Patterson continued. "And I don't know how to answer that, because there isn't a good answer," Ezra replied honestly. "There's only the truth that some people choose to put themselves at risk so that others don't have to, and sometimes that choice costs them everything. But how do I help him understand that without making it sound like I'm okay with losing my husband? By showing him that you can honor his father's sacrifice while still being angry about it. Grief and pride aren't opposites. They're both part of loving someone who chose service over safety." They talked for another hour, While Tommy and Marcus worked on the car together, Ezra learned that Marcus's acting out was focused specifically on authority figures, teachers, coaches, and counselors who tried to tell him how to process his father's death. The boy wasn't rejecting help. He was rejecting platitudes from people who didn't understand the unique nature of military sacrifice. "Would you be willing to bring Marcus here regularly?" Ezra asked. "Not for formal counseling, but to spend time with other kids who've lost military parents, and to work on projects that give him something constructive to do with his anger. You think that would help?" "I think Marcus needs to understand that his father's sacrifice was meaningful without being told that he should feel grateful for it. And the only people who can teach him that are others who've made similar losses and found ways to live with them." When Tommy and Marcus returned from the workshop, both were covered in grease and talking animatedly about carburetor rebuilding. The transformation in Marcus's demeanor was dramatic. He still carried his grief and anger, but the defensive hostility had been replaced by something approaching normal teenage enthusiasm. "Mum, did you know that Tommy's grandfather served in Vietnam? And that he's helped like 50 families deal with military stuff?" "I did know that," Mrs. Patterson replied, smiling at her son's first sign of genuine engagement in months. "And Tommy's parents died when he was younger. But he turned out okay because his grandfather taught him how to handle problems without just being angry all the time." Tommy caught Ezra's eye and smiled. Over the years, he had learned to share his own story with other young people who were struggling, understanding that sometimes the most powerful help came from peers who had faced similar challenges. "Marcus," Ezra said, "would you be interested in coming back next weekend to continue work on the Mustang? And maybe meeting some other teenagers who've lost military parents? Would Tommy be here?" "Every Saturday," Tommy confirmed, "along with about 6 other kids whose parents served. We work on projects together and talk about stuff when we need to." "What kind of stuff?" "Like how to be proud of your parents without being okay with losing them, and how to handle people who think they understand military families but really don't." Marcus looked at his mother, then back at Tommy and Ezra. "Yeah, I'd like that," as the Pattersons prepared to leave. Mrs. Patterson pulled Ezra aside. "How do you do it? How do you help so many families when you're dealing with your own losses?" "I'm not dealing with my losses," Ezra corrected gently. "I'm using them. There's a difference between recovering from trauma and learning to make trauma useful to others." "And Tommy, how did you help him through losing his parents?" "By teaching him that strength isn't about not getting hurt. It's about what you do with the hurt once you have it." After they left, Tommy and Ezra cleaned up the workshop together, a ritual they had maintained since Tommy was old enough to help with tools. "Marcus reminds me of myself when I first came here," Tommy said, organizing wrenches with the precision his grandfather had taught him. Angry at everyone and everything, but mostly angry that being angry didn't change anything. "What do you think helped you the most?" Tommy considered the question carefully. "Learning that other people had gone through similar things and figured out how to be okay, and having projects that let me build stuff instead of just breaking stuff. Is that what you want to do after high school?" "Keep working with military families. I want to study counseling in college, then come back and expand what we're doing here. Maybe work with active duty families too, not just veterans." Ezra felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with Tommy's academic achievements or his personal growth. Though both were considerable, his pride came from watching a young man who had every reason to be bitter about loss choose instead to use his experience to help others. "You know," Ezra said, "I think that's exactly what your parents would have wanted for you." Tommy nodded, understanding that his grandfather was referring not just to his biological parents, but to the extended family of military personnel who had shaped both their lives. "Grandpa, yes. Son, when I was little, I thought you were just my grandfather. Then I found out you were a war hero. Now I understand that you're something even better." "What's that?" "You're a man who figured out how to turn his worst experiences into other people's hope." That evening, As they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint Norfolk's skyline in shades of gold and pink, Ezra reflected on the journey that had brought them from a moment of public humiliation to a life dedicated to helping others navigate similar challenges. The house that had once been a quiet refuge for an elderly man raising his grandson had become a hub of healing for dozens of military families. The workshop that Tommy had suggested building had become a place where grieving teenagers could channel their anger into constructive projects. And the man who had once endured harassment in silence had found ways to use his experience to prevent other veterans from facing similar isolation. "You know what I learned from Commander Lawson?" Ezra said, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "What's that?" "That sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up teaching us the most important lessons about how to help others." Do you still hear from him? Occasionally, he sends updates about his work with disabled veterans. "Turns out that learning to be better is a lifelong project, but it's worth doing," Tommy smiled, understanding that his grandfather's capacity for turning enemies into allies extended far beyond their personal situation into a philosophy that had shaped everything about their life together. "Grandpa, I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "All those years when people didn't know about your military service, you were still serving, just differently." "How so?" "Because service isn't about uniforms or recognition. It's about using whatever strength you have to help people who need help." Ezra reached over and squeezed his grandson's shoulder, understanding that the most important lesson he'd ever taught had not only been learned, but internalized so completely that Tommy could teach it to others. "That's exactly right, son. And now you get to spend the rest of your life figuring out how to serve others with the strength you've developed." As they headed inside to prepare for another day of helping military families navigate the complex process of healing and growth, both grandfather and grandson understood that their story had become part of something larger, a continuing mission to ensure that service members and their families never faced their challenges alone, and that the lessons learned through hardship could be transformed into hope for others facing similar struggles. The quiet house in Norfolk had become a beacon for families learning that strength could be gentle, that healing could be productive, and that the greatest victories were those that helped others discover their own capacity for resilience and growth. This story reminds us that true strength lies not in dominance, but in the wisdom to know when restraint requires more courage than action. Sometimes the greatest heroes are those who choose to help others become better rather than simply proving their own power. Would you like another story?